The community center smelled like old books, floor wax, and the faint sweetness of someone's cinnamon tea. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a soft yellow glow on mismatched chairs arranged in a loose semicircle around a slightly battered upright piano in the corner. It wasn't much, chipped paint on the legs, a few keys that stuck if you didn't press them just right. But to her it was sacred. She'd been coming here every Tuesday for the past 3 years. Not to perform, but to listen. To watch people share poems they'd scribbled on napkins, sing folk songs with shaky voices, or tell stories about fishing trips gone wrong. There was something honest about it. No stage lights, no judges, no pressure, just people being real. Tonight, though, she wasn't just listening. She was sitting on the edge of her chair, fingers twisting the hem of her sweater, heart thumping like a metronome set too fast. Her best friend had practically dragged her here. "You practice every single day," her friend had said over coffee that afternoon, eyes wide with gentle insistence. "You play better than half the people on the radio. Just one song. That's all. One song and I'll buy you that fancy lavender soap you like." She'd laughed it off at first. "I'm not a performer," she'd said, stirring her tea slowly. "I teach kids how to find middle C, that's different." "But you feel it," her friend had pressed. "You really feel the music. People should hear that." Now, standing near the piano with a small note card in her hand, her name scribbled in blue ink next on the list, she wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake. The room was fuller than usual. Maybe 20 people, mostly regulars. Mrs. Langley with her knitting, Mr. Patel, who always brought homemade cookies, a couple of high schoolers whispering in the back, and then there was him. He sat near the rear, legs stretched out, phone in one hand, laughing loudly at something on the screen. He looked out of place. Sharp jacket, expensive-looking watch, the kind of person who probably flew first class and never took the bus. He hadn't been here before. Probably visiting family, she guessed. His voice cut through the warm murmur of conversation like a shard of glass, confident, careless. The current performer, a teenager with a guitar and a trembling voice, finished his song about lost love and summer rain, the room clapped warmly. The organizer, a kind-faced woman named Diane, smiled and glanced at the list. "Next up, we have someone new tonight. Give a warm welcome to our friend from Oakwood Elementary." A few polite claps. She walked to the piano, legs stiff, trying not to look at anyone. She sat down, adjusted the bench, placed her hands over the keys. The wood was cool under her palms. She took a breath. Just play like you do at home, just for yourself. She chose Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major op. 9 No. 2. Not because it was flashy, it wasn't, but because it felt like a quiet conversation. Gentle, flowing, full of longing. She'd played it 1,000 times in her tiny apartment, late at night when the world was asleep. It was her safe place. Her fingers found the opening notes. Soft. Delicate. The melody rose like mist off a lake at dawn. For a few seconds, the room settled into a hush. Even the fluorescent lights seemed to dim in respect, then laughter, not a chuckle. Not a nervous giggle. A full, loud, dismissive laugh from the back of the room. "Is that supposed to be music?" the man said, voice dripping with mockery. He turned to the guy beside him, probably a cousin or old friend, and added, "Sounds like my cat walking across the keyboard." A few people shifted uncomfortably. Someone coughed. Mrs. Langley shot him a look sharp enough to slice bread, but the damage was done. Her fingers froze for half a beat, just long enough to break the spell. The next note came out flat, hesitant. Her chest tightened. Heat rushed to her face. She wanted to stand up and walk out, but that would mean letting him win. So she kept going. Note by note, breath by breath, she finished the piece. Not perfectly, not like she could have, but she finished it. The applause that followed was kind. Too kind. Overly enthusiastic, like people were trying to make up for what that man had done. She nodded quickly, mumbled a thank you, and hurried back to her seat, eyes fixed on the floor. Her friend squeezed her hand. "Ignore him," she whispered fiercely. "He doesn't know anything." But it wasn't about knowledge. It was about respect, about the quiet courage it took to stand up and share something fragile in front of strangers. And he'd crushed it like it was nothing. After the event ended, people milled about, sipping tea, chatting. She stayed in her seat, pretending to check her phone, waiting for the room to empty. She didn't want to talk to anyone. Didn't want to see pity in their eyes, or worse, pretend nothing happened. The man was still there, laughing with his friend near the coat rack. He hadn't even noticed her. To him it was just a joke. A throwaway comment, 5 seconds of amusement in an otherwise boring evening. She finally stood, pulled on her coat, and slipped out the side door into the cool night air. The street was quiet. A street lamp flickered above her. She walked slowly toward the bus stop, arms wrapped around herself not from the cold but from the hollow feeling inside. She'd played piano since she was 6. Her grandmother had been the one to teach her, not just notes and scales, but how to listen. Music isn't just in your fingers, her grandmother used to say in her thick accent, hands resting gently on the keys. It's in your bones, in your breath. When you play, you're not making sound. You're letting the silence speak. She'd never forgotten that. Even now, teaching first graders how to clap to a beat or third graders how to read treble clef, she tried to pass on that same reverence. Music wasn't entertainment. It was connection. It was truth. And tonight, someone had treated it like a punchline. Back in her apartment, an old building with creaky floors and windows that rattled when the wind blew, she didn't turn on the lights. She went straight to her piano, a second-hand baby grand she'd saved for 2 years to buy. It wasn't fancy, but it had a warm, rich tone that responded to the lightest touch. She sat down. No music sheet, no plan. Just her, the piano, and the quiet anger still simmering in her chest. She placed her hands on the keys, closed her eyes, and played that same Chopin nocturne again, but this time it was different. This time she didn't hold back. She didn't play for an audience. She didn't play to impress. She played like her grandmother taught her, rooted, centered, every note drawn from deep inside. Her fingers pressed with intention, not force. Her body leaned into the sound, not away from it. And as the melody unfolded, something shifted. The air in the room grew thick, charged like before a summer storm. The glass on her coffee table began to hum. A framed photo on the wall vibrated against its hook. Even the curtains seemed to flutter. Though the windows were closed, she hit a low E-flat near the end, the same note that opened the piece, and held it. Not loud, not aggressive, but full, resonant, complete. The entire room trembled, not violently, not dangerously, but unmistakably, like the house itself was sighing in recognition. She let the note fade slowly, naturally, until only silence remained. Then she opened her eyes. Her teacup on the piano lid had a thin ring of water around its base, ripples still moving. She stared at it, stunned. She'd known, of course, that she could do this. Her grandmother had shown her how to channel energy through sound, how a single note played with total presence could move more than just air. But she'd never done it outside of practice, never in front of anyone. It felt too intimate, too powerful, like revealing a secret part of your soul. And now, after being laughed at like she was nothing, she realized something. Her gift wasn't about being perfect. It wasn't about dazzling crowds or winning competitions. It was about truth, about making people really feel something they'd forgotten how to feel. She didn't need his approval. She didn't need anyone's, but maybe, just maybe, she needed to show them what real music could do. Not to prove him wrong, but to remind everyone, including herself, that some things can't be mocked. Some things shake the room whether you believe in them or not. She stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the sleeping neighborhood. Somewhere out there, that man was probably already forgetting what he'd said, but she wouldn't forget. Not the sting, not the silence that followed, and not the way the room had answered her back with its own quiet power. Tomorrow she'd go back to school. She'd help little hands find their way across the keys. She'd smile when a child played hot cross buns with pride. And she'd keep practicing quietly, faithfully, deeply, because music wasn't for the loud. It was for the listening, and one day maybe that man would learn how to listen too. But until then, she had her piano. She had her truth. And she had that one note, the one that could shake a room, heal a heart, or silence a laugh with nothing but its own pure, unshakable presence. She turned off the lamp, leaving the piano in shadow. But in her mind, the note still rang, clear, strong, and alive. She didn't sleep much that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard that laugh, sharp, careless, echoing in the quiet space between her thoughts. It wasn't just the sound of it. It was what it meant, that her music, something she'd poured years of quiet devotion into, was nothing more than background noise to someone who didn't even bother to listen. She tossed and turned, sheets tangled around her legs, the memory of the room's polite applause feeling more like pity than praise. By 5 a.m. she gave up. She padded barefoot to the kitchen, made tea, chamomile, the kind her grandmother always said soothes the storm inside, and sat at the small table by the window. Outside, the street was still dark, only a few porch lights glowing like distant stars. The city hadn't woken up yet. For a few precious minutes, the world felt soft again. She sipped her tea slowly, steam curling into the cool air. Her eyes drifted to the piano in the next room, its dark wood barely visible in the dim light. She thought about last night, how her hands had shaken, how the music had felt thin like paper tearing. But then she remembered what happened after she got home, the way the room had answered her. The way that single note had filled the space like a heartbeat. That wasn't just skill. That was something deeper. Her grandmother had called it soul resonance, not a fancy term from a textbook, just something she'd whispered during late-night lessons in their old apartment above the bakery, where the smell of rising dough mixed with the scent of aged piano wood. "You don't play the piano," her grandmother used to say, hands resting lightly on the keys. "You listen to it. And when you're ready, it listens back." She'd been 7 the first time she felt it. They were practicing a simple scale, C major up and down, and her grandmother stopped her mid-run. "Again," she said, voice calm but firm. "But this time, don't think about your fingers. Think about your feet. Feel the floor. Feel your breath. Now play." She did, and something shifted. The note didn't just sound, it landed. Like a stone dropped into still water, the whole room seemed to lean in. "What was that?" she'd asked, wide-eyed. Her grandmother smiled, eyes crinkling at the corners. "That, my love, was truth." From then on, lessons weren't just about reading notes or keeping time. They were about presence, about grounding yourself so deeply in the moment that the music wasn't something you made. It was something you allowed to happen through you. Her grandmother taught her to sit with her spine straight but relaxed, feet flat on the floor, shoulders loose. "Your body is an instrument too," she'd say. "If it's tense, the sound will be tight. If it's open, the sound will fly." Most people never noticed the difference. To them, piano was just fingers on keys. But those who really listened, like the old man who used to sit outside their window every Sunday, eyes closed, tears on his cheeks, knew. They felt it in their chest, in their bones. After her grandmother passed, she stopped playing like that. Not on purpose. Life just got in the way. College, student loans, job interviews, rent. She still played every day, but it became routine, something to unwind, not something sacred. She taught kids the basics, helped them pass their recitals, clapped when they hit the right notes. But she never showed them the deeper part. The part that could make a room hold its breath until last night. When she played that Chopin piece at home, something had woken up inside her. Not anger, not pride, just remembering. Remembering who she was before the world told her to be small. Before she started doubting whether her music mattered, she finished her tea and walked to the piano. Dawn was just beginning to paint the sky in pale pinks and golds. She sat down not to practice but to listen. She placed her hands on the keys, no music sheet, no plan. Just silence and intention. She played a single note. Middle C, not loud, not soft, just full. She let it ring, feeling the vibration travel up her arms, into her shoulders, down her spine. She breathed with it, let it move through her like a current. The curtains fluttered. The glass on the shelf gave a soft, clear chime. Even the floor beneath her feet seemed to hum. She smiled, just a little. Not because she'd done something impressive, but because she'd come home. To herself. Over the next few days, she played like this every morning. No audience, no expectations. Just her, the piano, and the quiet truth of sound. She experimented. Different notes, different pressures, different ways of releasing the key. She learned that a low G played with grounded stillness could make the walls tremble. A high F-sharp released with a sigh could make the air feel lighter, like after rain. It wasn't magic. It was physics, yes, but also something beyond it. It was attention. It was love. At school, she noticed things she hadn't before. The way a child's eyes lit up when they finally played a song all the way through. The way another kid would hum a melody under their breath during math class. Music wasn't just in the piano room, it was everywhere, if you paid attention. One afternoon, during a break between classes, she found herself watching a group of students trying to tune a guitar in the music corner. One of them kept strumming a string, frowning. "It never sounds right," he muttered. She walked over. "Mind if I try?" He handed her the guitar. She held it gently, feeling its weight, its wood. She plucked the string he'd been struggling with. Listened. Then, with a slow turn of the tuning peg, she adjusted it just slightly. "Now try," she said, handing it back. He strummed. His eyes widened. "Whoa, it's clean," she nodded. "Sometimes you don't need to force it. You just need to listen until it tells you what it needs." He looked at her like she'd just revealed a secret. That night, she thought about that moment, about how easy it was to forget that everything has a voice if you're willing to hear it. She also thought about the man from the community center. She didn't hate him. She didn't even really think about him much. But his laugh had cracked something open. Not a wound, a door. And behind it was everything she'd tucked away. She knew she couldn't keep hiding this part of herself. Not because she wanted fame or revenge, but because the world needed more listening, more truth, more moments where people stopped scrolling, stopped talking, and just felt. A few days later, Diane from the community center called. "I heard what happened," she said, voice gentle but firm. "And I want you to know no one here thinks less of you. In fact, a lot of people were upset with how that man behaved." She thanked her, surprised by the warmth in Diane's voice. "And," Diane continued, "I know this might seem sudden, but the Lyric Theater is hosting their annual Arts and Heritage Gala next month. They're looking for local performers, real ones, not just polished acts. People with heart. I told them about you." Her stomach dropped. "Me, but I'm not a stage performer." "You don't have to be," Diane said. "Just be you. Play like you do when no one's watching. That's what they want." She hesitated. The Lyric Theater was old, over 100 years, and famous for its acoustics. Musicians came from all over just to play there once. The idea of standing on that stage under real stage lights with an actual audience, it terrified her. But then she remembered the note. The one that shook the room. Maybe that's exactly where it needed to be heard. "I'll think about it," she said. After hanging up, she sat by the window again. Rain had started to fall, soft and steady, tapping against the glass like a quiet rhythm. She thought about her grandmother. How she'd played in tiny village halls during the war. How people would gather just to hear her. Not because she was famous, but because her music gave them hope. "When words fail," she used to say, "sound speaks." Maybe it was time to let sound speak again. She didn't decide right away. But that night she played a new piece, one she'd never tried before. A modern composition built around a single repeating note, slowly building into something vast and quiet and powerful. She played it 3 times, each time letting the note sink deeper, resonate longer. By the 3rd time, her whole apartment felt alive. The next morning, she called Diane back. "I'll do it," she said. There was a pause, then a soft laugh. "Good. The world needs to hear you." She hung up, heart racing, but not from fear. From purpose. She didn't tell anyone else, not even her best friend. She just began to prepare. Not by memorizing flashy runs or perfecting dynamics, but by returning to the root. Every morning she sat in silence before playing. She practiced grounding, feeling her feet on the floor, her breath in her belly. She played single notes for 10 minutes at a time, learning how each one lived in the space. She also visited the Lyric Theater, not to perform, just to sit in the empty hall. She walked down the center aisle, ran her hand along the velvet seats, stood on the stage. She closed her eyes and imagined playing there, felt the wood beneath her shoes, the high ceiling above, the history in the walls. And she knew this wasn't about proving anything to anyone. It was about offering something true. Back home, she chose the piece she would play. Not Chopin this time, something simpler. Something that began with one note and let it grow. She practiced it slowly, patiently, not for perfection but for presence. And every time she played that opening note, the room answered, not with noise but with stillness, the kind of stillness that only comes when something real has been spoken. She didn't know if the man from the community center would be there. She didn't care. What mattered was that she would be there, with her whole self, her whole truth. And that one note that could shake a room. Because sometimes, all it takes is one honest sound to remind people what silence really is. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough. The week before the gala, the town buzzed with quiet excitement. Posters went up in coffee shops and library windows. Arts and Heritage Night at the Lyric Theater. And local musicians tuned their instruments with extra care. For most, it was just another community event. But for him, it felt like something heavier. He hadn't meant to be cruel that night at the community center. It had just slipped out, a reflex, really. He'd been bored, jet-lagged from a business trip, and the music had felt slow, old-fashioned. So he'd made a joke, the kind he'd make in a boardroom without thinking twice. But the look on her face, the way her shoulders had stiffened, how she'd finished playing like she was holding her breath, had stuck with him. His younger sister had been there that night. She didn't say much when they got home, just handed him a mug of tea and said, "You really hurt her, you know." He'd brushed it off at first. It was just a comment. "She's been coming to those nights for years," his sister replied, voice quiet but firm. "She never plays, never. And she did it tonight because she trusted that room. And you laughed like it was nothing." He didn't sleep well after that. Not because he felt guilty, though he did, but because he realized something uncomfortable. He'd stopped listening. Not just to music, but to people, to silence, to anything that didn't move fast or promise a return on investment. He'd spent the last decade climbing a ladder he wasn't sure he even wanted to be on. Flights, meetings, spreadsheets, hotel rooms that all looked the same. He'd forgotten what it felt like to sit still, to let something unfold without trying to fix it, sell it, or scroll past it. So when he saw the flyer for the gala, with her name listed among the performers, he decided to go. Not to apologize, not to make things right, just to listen. The night of the event, the Lyric Theater glowed under soft amber lights. Built in 1912, it had survived 2 world wars, a fire, and decades of neglect before being lovingly restored by locals. Its red velvet seats, gilded balconies, and high domed ceiling gave it the feeling of a place where time slowed down. He arrived early, not wanting to draw attention. He bought a ticket at the door, took a program, and slipped into a seat near the back, same as before. The theater filled slowly. Families, elderly couples, students from the art school. No one recognized him. No one cared. And for the first time in years, that felt like a relief. The show began with a folk singer, then a spoken word poet, then a string quartet of high schoolers who played with nervous energy and obvious love. Each act was met with warm applause. The room felt alive, not loud, but present. People leaned forward. They smiled. They wiped their eyes. He kept glancing at the program. Her name was third from the end. When the stagehand dimmed the house lights and announced her, his stomach tightened. He sat up straighter. She walked out alone. No fanfare, no dramatic entrance. Just a woman in a simple dark dress, calm and quiet, like she was walking into her own living room. She nodded to the audience, sat at the grand piano on stage, and placed her hands in her lap. She didn't rush. She closed her eyes, took a breath, let the silence settle, and then she played. It wasn't a song most people would recognize. No big chords, no fast runs. Just a single note, low, deep, resonant, held with such stillness it felt like the whole theater leaned into it. And then it happened. The chandeliers above gave the faintest shimmer. Not from wind, there was none, but from vibration. The wooden floor beneath his feet hummed, just barely. A glass of water on the ledge in front of him rippled, concentric circles spreading outward like whispers. People stopped shifting in their seats, stopped breathing almost. He felt it in his chest, a pressure not painful but deep. Like something long buried had just been touched. She played that note again. Same pitch, same intention. But this time, she let it bloom into a second note, then a third, weaving a sparse, haunting melody that seemed to rise from the floorboards themselves. The piece was built on repetition, on space, on the weight of each sound. It wasn't about showing off. It was about revealing. Halfway through, a child in the front row dropped a program. The soft thud should have broken the spell, but it didn't. Because the music wasn't just in the air, it was in the bones of the building, in the air between people, in the quiet ache of being human. He didn't know how long it lasted. 5 minutes, 10, time didn't matter. All that mattered was the sound, and the silence it carved around itself. When she finally lifted her hands from the keys, the last note hung in the air like smoke. No one clapped right away. No one dared. They just sat there stunned, as if waking from a dream they didn't want to leave. Then, slowly, someone began to clap. Then another. Then the whole theater rose to its feet, not out of habit but out of gratitude. She stood, eyes glistening, and gave a small bow. No grand gesture, just a quiet thank you before stepping back into the wings. He stayed seated long after the applause faded. His hands were shaking. Not from nerves, from something deeper. He hadn't cried in years, not since his father's funeral, but now his throat felt tight, his eyes hot. It wasn't sadness. It was recognition. He'd spent his life chasing noise, deals, deadlines, distractions, and in one single note, he'd been reminded of what he'd been missing. Stillness. Truth. The kind of beauty that doesn't shout, but waits patiently for you to notice. After the show ended and people began filing out, he lingered. He didn't go backstage. He didn't deserve that. Instead, he found a quiet corner near the coat check and pulled out a small notepad he always carried for work. He tore out a clean page and wrote slowly, carefully, "I was wrong. You didn't just play a note, you reminded me what silence sounds like." He didn't sign it, didn't ask for anything, just folded it neatly and handed it to a volunteer near the stage door with a quiet, "Could you give this to her, please?" The volunteer nodded, tucking it into a stack of other notes and flowers. He walked home that night, hands in his pockets, the city lights reflecting in puddles from an earlier rain. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel the urge to check his phone, didn't feel the need to fill the quiet with noise. He just walked and listened, to the distant hum of traffic, to the rustle of leaves in the breeze, to his own breath. Back at his sister's house, he was staying with her while in town. He found her in the kitchen washing dishes. "You went," she said, not turning around. He nodded. "Yeah, was it? It was everything," he said softly. She turned off the faucet and looked at him. Really looked. And for the first time in years, she saw something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Softness. He didn't say much more that night. But the next morning, he called his office and canceled his return flight. He asked for a week off. No reason, just personal time. His boss laughed. "Since when do you take personal time?" "Since now," he said. Over the next few days, he started showing up at the community center. Not to perform, not to speak, just to help. He stacked chairs after events, fixed the wobbly leg on the coffee table, carried boxes of donated sheet music. No one asked why. They just accepted his quiet presence like it belonged. One afternoon, Diane, the woman who ran the center, handed him a clipboard. "We're planning a spring music workshop for kids," she said. "Need someone to handle logistics. You seem like you've got good organizational skills." He took the clipboard. "I'd be honored," she smiled. "Good, because music isn't just about playing. It's about making space for others to be heard." He thought about that all the way home. Meanwhile, she received his note the next day. She read it once, then again, holding it like it was fragile. She didn't know who it was from. No name, no signature, but she knew. She tucked it into the pocket of her piano bench, right next to her grandmother's old tuning fork. She didn't need an apology. But she appreciated the listening, because that's what music had always been about. Not perfection, not performance, but connection. And sometimes all it took was one honest note to open a door someone didn't even know was closed. The gala changed things in the town, in small but real ways. More people signed up for music classes. Local businesses started sponsoring student recitals. Even the high school band director said his kids were practicing with more heart, but the biggest change was quieter. It was in the way people paused before speaking, in the way strangers held eye contact a second longer, in the way silence no longer felt empty but full of possibility. And for him, it was the beginning of something new. Not a grand transformation, but a slow return to himself, to the world, to the simple act of paying attention. He still didn't know if he'd ever say sorry out loud. Maybe he didn't need to. Maybe the real apology was in the showing up, in the listening, in the space he was learning to hold for music, for others, for the quiet truth that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is let one note shake the room, and then stay still enough to feel it. The morning after the gala, she woke to sunlight streaming through her window and a strange quiet in her chest. Not emptiness, but peace. She hadn't expected that. She'd braced herself for nerves, second-guessing, maybe even regret. But instead she felt clear, like a window had been wiped clean after years of dust. She made coffee, wrapped her hands around the warm mug, and sat by the piano. No urge to play, just to be near it. The instrument seemed different now, not just hers, but something shared. As if the sound she'd made the night before had left a trace in the wood, in the air, in the very walls of her apartment. Her phone buzzed on the table. A message from Diane. "You shook the rafters, literally. Old Mr. Hensley said his hearing aid picked up vibrations he hasn't felt since the '78 earthquake." She laughed softly. Then another message popped up from the local paper. A reporter wanted to do a short feature. "Just a human interest piece," they wrote. About music that moves more than just air. She almost said no. She didn't want to be a spectacle. But then she thought of her students, the ones who believed music was only for the talented, the ones who gave up after hitting one wrong note. Maybe this could show them something else, that music isn't about being perfect. It's about being present, she agreed. The article came out 3 days later. The headline read, "The Woman Who Made Sound Visible." It wasn't flashy. Just a few paragraphs about her teaching job, her grandmother's influence, and how she believed a single note, played with full attention, can change a room. There was a photo of her at the piano, eyes closed, hands hovering just above the keys, not performing, listening. She didn't expect much to come of it. But by the end of the week, her voicemail was full. Parents calling to enroll their kids, a retired violinist offering to collaborate. Even the theater's caretaker left a message. "The lyric hasn't sounded this alive in 50 years. Whatever you did, thank you." Most surprising of all, her classroom began to change. Children who used to fidget during piano time now sat still, eyes wide, when she played even a simple scale. One little boy, usually loud and restless, whispered after class, "Miss, can you play that note again? The one that made my shoes buzz?" She did, and the whole class went silent, feet flat on the floor, feeling the vibration travel up through their socks. She started weaving her grandmother's lessons into her teaching, not as technique, but as feeling. "Before you play," she'd say, "feel your feet on the ground. Take a breath. Ask the piano what it wants to say today." At first the kids giggled, but soon they began to understand. They'd press a key and close their eyes. "It feels warm," one said, "like sunshine." Another, "Mine sounds like rain on a roof." Music became less about right and wrong, more about listening inside and out. Meanwhile, he kept showing up at the community center. At first, people watched him out of the corner of their eyes. The man who'd laughed that night now stacking chairs, sweeping floors, helping set up for poetry readings. He didn't talk much, didn't draw attention, but he was always there, early and staying late, doing the work no one else wanted to do. One rainy Tuesday, Diane asked him to fix the old speaker system in the back room. He spent 3 hours rewiring it, hands stained with dust and solder. When it finally crackled to life with a clear tone, he didn't smile, just nodded and wiped his hands on his jeans. "You're good with your hands," Diane said, handing him a cup of tea. "I used to build model airplanes as a kid," he replied. Before everything became digital, she didn't press. But she noticed how he lingered near the piano after everyone left, sometimes just standing there staring at the keys like they held answers. One evening, she found him reading the newspaper article about her. He quickly folded it when he saw her. "You don't have to hide that," she said gently. "I just wanted to understand," he admitted. "Understand what?" "How someone can make a room feel like it's breathing." She looked at him, really looked, saw the tired lines around his eyes, the way his shoulders carried weight he didn't know how to put down. "It's not magic," she said. "It's just paying attention. To yourself. To the space. To the silence between notes." He nodded slowly, like he was storing the words somewhere safe. A few days later, he signed up to help organize the spring music workshop, a free program for kids who couldn't afford lessons. He handled schedules, ordered supplies, even painted the old storage closet into a mini practice room. He never asked to meet her, never sought recognition, but his actions spoke louder than any apology ever could. Back at school, she began experimenting. She'd play a single low note during circle time and ask the children to describe what it made them feel. "Heavy," said one. Like a bear walking. Safe, said another. Like my dad's voice. She taught them to hum along with piano notes to feel the resonance in their chests. Some kids started bringing in homemade instruments, shakers from rice in jars, drums from oatmeal containers. Music wasn't just in the piano anymore, it was everywhere. One afternoon, a shy girl who rarely spoke raised her hand. Can we make a song with just one note? She asked. Of course, she said. So they did. The whole class sat in a circle. She played a deep C. They all hummed it together. Then they added claps, then stomps, then whispers. What started as one note became a living thing, shifting, breathing, growing. When they finished, the room was so quiet you could hear the clock ticking on the wall. The girl who'd asked the question was smiling. That night she wrote in her journal, "Music isn't made by perfect hands. It's made by open hearts." The ripple kept spreading. A local cafe started hosting silent listening nights. No talking, just live piano for an hour. People came not to socialize but to sit, drink tea, and just listen. Attendance grew each week. The high school band director invited her to speak to his students. She didn't give a lecture. She played one note, asked them to close their eyes. Don't think about how it sounds, she said. Think about how it feels in your body. Afterward, a trumpet player stayed behind. I've been playing for 10 years, he said, voice thick, and I never thought about it like that. Even the town council took notice. They approved funding to restore the old upright piano at the community center, the same one she'd played that night. It's historic, someone said. And now it's sacred. She visited the center one Saturday to test the newly tuned piano. As she played a simple scale, she felt it, the same resonance, the same quiet power. The room remembered. He was there, painting trim along the windows. He stopped when she started playing. Didn't turn around. Just stood with his brush in hand, listening. She didn't stop. Played a little longer than she planned. Let the notes hang in the air like threads connecting them across the room. When she finished, he finally turned. Their eyes met. No words, just a nod. And in that nod was everything. Regret, respect, gratitude. She nodded back. Later, Diane told her he'd started taking beginner piano lessons from an elderly volunteer who taught on Tuesday mornings. Said he wants to understand what it feels like to make something beautiful with his own hands, Diane said, smiling over her coffee. She wasn't surprised. Some lessons don't come from words. They come from being shaken, gently, deeply, by something true. One evening, as she walked home from school, she passed the park where kids were playing soccer under the fading sun. A street musician sat on a bench playing a worn-out saxophone. The melody was simple, slightly off-key, but full of heart. People slowed as they passed. Some dropped coins. Others just stood for a moment listening. She stopped too, closed her eyes, felt the music move through her, and in that moment she understood. Her gift wasn't just hers. It was a reminder, a spark, a call to pay attention, to the world, to each other, to the quiet magic hiding in plain sight. She didn't need a stage. She didn't need applause. She just needed to keep showing up, with open hands, open ears, and a heart willing to let one note shake the room. And then hold the silence that follows. Because that's where the real music lives, not in perfection, but in presence. And in a town that had almost forgotten how to listen, that was more than enough. 1 year almost to the day after that open mic night, the community center buzzed with a different kind of energy, not the nervous hum of people unsure if they belonged, but the warm, steady thrum of people who knew they did. Folding chairs were arranged in wide arcs, not just around the piano, but around clusters of small instruments, hand drums, xylophones, even a cello resting in a corner like a quiet guest. Colorful drawings by local kids lined the walls. My favorite sound, what music feels like, the note that shook my shoes. This wasn't just another event. It was the first community resonance concert, a name dreamed up by a group of students who'd been part of the spring workshop. The idea was simple, music made by everyone for everyone. No auditions, no solos unless someone wanted to share. Just sound, shared openly, honestly, together. She stood near the back, watching as people arrived. Parents holding toddlers' hands, teens carrying guitars and beat-up cases, elderly neighbors helping each other with coats. And there, near the refreshment table, was him, filling cups with lemonade, arranging cookies on a tray, moving with a calm she hadn't seen in him a year ago. He caught her eye and gave a small, quiet smile. No grand gesture, just presence. That was enough. She hadn't planned to play tonight. The whole point of the evening was to pass the torch, to let others feel the joy of being heard. But Diane had asked her to close the show. Not as a star, she'd said. As a guide. Just one piece to tie it all together. She'd agreed, but only if it was something new, something born from this year of listening, teaching, and healing. So she'd asked her students to help her write it. It started with a single note, a low C, chosen by a shy 8-year-old who said it felt like home. Then a teenager added a rhythm on a djembe. A retired teacher hummed a harmony. A high schooler wrote a short poem about silence after rain. Piece by piece, note by note, the song grew, not on paper but in the room, through shared breath and trust. Now, as the evening unfolded, she watched it come alive. A group of kindergartners played Twinkle Twinkle on tiny keyboards, their concentration so fierce it was almost comical. An elderly man sang a folk song in a language no one recognized but everyone felt. A teen who'd once been too nervous to speak in class played a guitar piece he'd written himself. Simple, raw, beautiful. Each act was met not with polite applause but with real joy. Smiles, tears, hands squeezing shoulders in silent support. Music wasn't performance anymore. It was conversation. When it was finally her turn, the room didn't hush out of obligation. It settled like a family gathering around a fire. She walked to the piano, the same upright from that first night now lovingly restored, its keys smooth and responsive. She sat, didn't rush, let the air fill with quiet. Then she played the opening note, just one, low, full, grounded, and the room answered. Not with noise, but with stillness so deep you could feel it in your ribs. The chandeliers trembled. The floorboards sighed. Even the air seemed to thicken, like the whole building was leaning in to listen. She held the note, letting it bloom into the melody her students had helped create, a piece that started with that single C and slowly wove in voices. Drums, a soft violin, the whispered poem. It wasn't complex. It didn't need to be. It was honest. And in that honesty it carried the weight of a whole year of healing. Halfway through, the children joined in, not on cue, but when they felt ready, humming, clapping, stomping in rhythm. Their voices weren't perfect. Some were off-key, some missed the beat, but together they made something whole, something alive. He stood at the back, arms crossed, eyes closed. Tears tracked down his cheeks, but he didn't wipe them away. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about what came next. His flight, his inbox, his next meeting. He was just here, feeling the vibration in his shoes, hearing the crack in a child's voice as they sang, letting the music move through him like water through stone. When the final note faded, held long enough to echo in the bones of everyone there, the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of breath, full of gratitude, full of the kind of peace that only comes when people truly connect. Then the room erupted. Not just applause, but laughter, hugs, people calling out, "Bravo," and "Thank you." A little girl ran up and handed her a drawing, a piano with sound waves that looked like arms hugging the whole town. She stood, heart pounding, and bowed not to an audience, but to a community. Afterward, people lingered. No one rushed to leave. They milled about, sharing stories, eating cookies, trying out the instruments. A group gathered around the piano, taking turns playing that opening note, giggling when the floor vibrated under their feet. He finally walked over. Not with a grand speech, just a cup of tea and a quiet, "That was everything." She took the tea. "It wasn't just me," she said. "It was all of us," he nodded. "I know. That's what made it real." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching a group of kids teach an elderly man how to play a simple rhythm on a drum. "I started lessons," he said after a while. "Piano, I'm terrible, but I'm learning to listen," she smiled. "That's the hardest part. And the most important." He looked at her, really looked. "I never thanked you. For not giving up. For showing us what music can really do." "You didn't need to thank me," she said gently. "You showed up. That was enough." And it was. Because healing isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a man learning to sit still, a child finding their voice, a room full of strangers realizing they belong to each other. Over the next few weeks, the ripple kept growing. The community resonance night became a monthly tradition. More people joined, not just to perform but to listen, to hold space, to be part of something bigger than themselves. Local schools started incorporating listening circles into their music programs. Even the town's coffee shop began ending each morning rush with 5 minutes of live piano. No talking aloud, just sound and steam and silence. She kept teaching, but her classroom felt different now. Less like a lesson, more like a sanctuary. Kids didn't just learn notes, they learned how to feel them, how to breathe with them, how to let music be a friend, not a test. And he kept coming, not as a guest, but as part of the fabric. He helped build a small outdoor stage in the park for summer concerts. He organized a fundraiser to buy new instruments for the school. And every Tuesday morning, without fail, he showed up for his piano lesson, fingers clumsy, rhythm shaky but heart wide open. One afternoon, months later, she found him practicing alone in the community center. He was working on a simple piece, just 5 notes repeated with growing confidence. He didn't hear her come in. She stood in the doorway watching, saw the focus in his eyes, the way his shoulders had softened, the quiet joy in his face when he finally got the timing right. When he finished, he looked up and saw her. Didn't stop, just smiled. "It's harder than it looks," he said. "It's supposed to be," she replied, stepping inside. "If it were easy, it wouldn't mean as much." He nodded, running his fingers over the keys like they were old friends. "I used to think music was something you consumed, like a product. But it's not, is it?" "No," she said, sitting beside him on the bench. "It's something you grow, together." They sat in silence for a moment. Then, without a word, she played that low C again, soft, steady, full. He closed his eyes, felt it in his chest, in his feet, in the quiet space between who he'd been and who he was becoming. And for the first time in a long time, the room didn't just shake, it sang, not because of one person, but because everyone inside it had finally learned how to listen. Years later, people in town would tell the story differently. Some said the piano itself had magic. Others swore the building was built on a natural resonance point. But those who were there that night, the night one note changed everything, knew the truth. It wasn't about the note, it was about the silence it created, the space it opened, the courage it gave people to be real. And in a world that often feels too loud, too fast, too divided, that kind of quiet courage is the rarest music of all. She never became famous, never toured, never recorded an album. But in that small town, her legacy lived, not in recordings or headlines, but in the way a child now closes their eyes before playing a scale, in the way strangers hold space for each other's songs, in the way a man who once laughed now sits in the back of the room, listening like his life depends on it, because sometimes it does, and all it takes is one true note, played with heart, heard with openness, to remind us that we're never really alone. The end isn't a finish line, it's a breath, a pause. A space where something new can begin, and in that space music waits, not to be performed but to be shared, again and again and again. The story didn't end with the concert. Stories like this never really do. They keep breathing, keep growing in quiet ways that don't make headlines but change lives all the same. A few months after the community resonance night, something unexpected happened. A letter arrived, not by email, not by text, but real paper, folded carefully and sealed with a wax stamp shaped like a music note. It came from a small town 3 states away. A teacher there had read the article about the piano that shook the room. She'd shown it to her students, kids in a rural school with no music program, no instruments, just a few old recorders gathering dust in a closet. They'd been so moved, they'd started their own listening circle during lunch, humming notes, tapping rhythms on desks, sharing songs their grandparents taught them. Now they were asking, could someone come teach them how to build a piano out of wood and wire? Not a real one, just something that could carry sound, something they could make together. She read the letter twice, then tucked it into her piano bench next to the note from the gala night. She didn't say yes right away, but she didn't say no either. Instead, she began to wonder, what if this wasn't just about one room, one town, one piano? What if it was about something bigger? She started small. She reached out to other music teachers online. Not the famous ones with millions of followers, but the quiet ones in underfunded schools, in community centers, in church basements. She shared simple exercises: how to feel resonance in your body, how to turn a coffee can into a drum, how to find music in silence. She didn't call it a method. She called it listening practice. To her surprise, people responded. A teacher in a desert town wrote back, "We don't have pianos, but we have wind. We've started recording how it sounds through old pipes and playing it during class." A retired nurse in a coastal village said she'd begun hosting sound walks with seniors, just walking slowly through the woods, listening to birds, leaves, their own footsteps. Music wasn't disappearing. It was returning to its roots, not as entertainment, but as connection. Meanwhile, back home, the community center became a kind of quiet hub. Not flashy, not funded by big grants, just a place where people knew they could come and be heard. Teenagers recorded spoken word over soft piano backing. Grandparents taught folk songs in their native languages. Even the local mechanic started bringing his harmonica on breaks, playing old blues tunes while kids gathered around, mesmerized. He was still there every week, still taking lessons, still terrible at reading sheet music. But he'd learned to play by ear now, simple melodies mostly. Lullabies his mother used to hum, songs he remembered from childhood. One rainy afternoon he played a tune so soft and tender that a little girl fell asleep on the couch nearby, curled up like a cat. No one clapped. No one needed to. The music had already done its work. Then came the storm. Not a metaphor, a real one. Late one October, heavy rains flooded the river that ran behind the town. Roads washed out. Power lines went down. The community center lost electricity for 3 days. People gathered anyway, bringing candles, blankets, and whatever food they had. Someone lit a fire in the old stone hearth. Another brought a battery-powered radio, but no one turned it on. Instead, someone started humming, then another joined in, then a drum, then a voice. For 3 nights, the center became a shelter, not just from the rain, but from fear. And music was the thread that held them together. No stage, no spotlight. Just people sharing sound in the dark, reminding each other they weren't alone. She played that low C again on the unlit piano, the note rising like a steady heartbeat in the candlelight. And the room, damp, cold, full of worry, felt warm. After the storm passed, something had shifted. People didn't just come to the center for events anymore. They came to check on each other, to share news, to sit in silence together. The line between music night and just being human had blurred completely. One spring morning, she received another letter, this time from a university. A professor of acoustics had heard about the Lyric Theater's resonant performances and wanted to study the building's unique sound properties. But when he visited, he didn't bring microphones or sensors. He brought his daughter, who'd stopped speaking after a car accident 2 years before. "She hasn't said a word," he wrote. "But last night after your concert, she hummed." He asked if she'd be willing to meet them. She said yes. They came on a quiet Tuesday. The girl sat near the piano, eyes down, fingers twisting the hem of her sweater. Her father hovered nearby, hopeful but careful not to push. She didn't play right away, just sat beside the girl, silent. Then she placed her hand gently on the piano lid. "This piano likes to listen," she said softly. "Want to say hello?" The girl didn't speak. But after a long pause, she reached out and pressed a single key, middle C. The note rang out, clear and bright, and then, so quietly it was almost a breath, the girl hummed along. Her father covered his mouth with his hand. Tears fell onto his shoes. They stayed for an hour. The girl played 3 notes, hummed a short melody. Didn't say a word, but she didn't need to. The music had spoken for her. After they left, she sat alone in the empty hall, hands resting on the keys. She thought about how sound could reach places words couldn't, how a single note could be a bridge, a lifeline, a home. That night she made a decision. She called Diane. "I think it's time," she said. Time for what? To let go. Diane understood. Not of music, but of being the only one holding the space. So they started training others. Not just to play, but to listen, to hold silence, to create rooms where people feel safe enough to be real. A retired librarian learned to lead sound meditations. A high school student became a youth coordinator for the workshops. Even he, now confident enough to play short pieces at gatherings, began mentoring younger beginners. She didn't disappear. She just stepped back, like a gardener thinning seedlings so the whole garden can grow. Years passed. The town changed, new faces, new buildings, new challenges. But the center remained. And every month, without fail, people still gathered for Resonance Night. Sometimes she played. Sometimes she didn't. But she always stayed to listen. One evening, decades later, she sat in the back row, gray hair pulled into a loose bun, hands folded in her lap. On stage was a young woman, barely 20, who'd grown up coming to these nights as a child. She sat at the piano, took a breath, and played a single note, low, full, grounded, and the room shook, not from volume. From truth. Tears filled her eyes, not from sadness, but from the quiet joy of seeing the circle complete itself. The gift had been passed, not as a performance, but as a practice, not as a secret, but as a shared language. After the show, the young woman found her in the hallway. "I've wanted to thank you," she said. "My grandmother brought me here when I was 6. I heard you play that note, and I knew I wanted to do that someday." She smiled. "You already are." They stood in silence for a moment, the hum of the building around them like a lullaby. "You know," the young woman said softly, "people say your note changed this town." She shook her head. It wasn't the note. It was the listening. The note was just the invitation, and that's the thing no one ever writes about in articles or posts online. Real change doesn't come from being loud. It comes from being still enough to hear what's already there, inside yourself, inside others, inside the quiet spaces between. She walked home that night under a sky full of stars. The streets were quiet. A neighbor waved from their porch. A dog barked in the distance. Somewhere a window was open and soft piano music drifted out into the night. She paused, closed her eyes, and listened. Not to judge. Not to fix. Just to be with it. Because that's where music lives. Not in perfection, not in fame, but in the simple, sacred act of paying attention. And as long as even one person keeps listening, the room will never stop shaking. It will just keep singing.